It was the summer of 1944, somewhere in the heart of America. The war raged oceans away, but here, behind barbed wire and pine trees, a different kind of silence ruled. The silence of disbelief. A group of German prisoners, fresh from the battlefields of North Africa and Normandy, stood in line outside the mess hall of a U.S. Army prisoner of war camp. They expected punishment, rations, maybe hard labor. Instead, they were handed metal trays and a small glass bottle filled with dark, fizzing liquid. Beside it, a white scoop slowly melting in a bowl. They stared at it, unsure. Some thought it was medicine, others a trick. Then one of them took a sip. The hiss, the sweetness, the strange bite of bubbles on his tongue. Laughter followed, quiet at first, then spreading like relief. For men raised on scarcity and fear, this was their first taste of America. Not through guns or propaganda, but through Coca-Cola and ice cream. They didn't know it yet, but that moment would change how they saw their captors, and the world they'd been told to hate. When the first ships carrying German prisoners arrived in the United States, the men aboard were not sure whether they would live to see land again. Most had been captured in North Africa or France. Paratroopers, tank crews, infantrymen, U-boat sailors. Many had been told that surrendering to the Americans was a death sentence. Hitler's propaganda had painted the United States as a collapsing, chaotic society, a land ruled by criminals and mongrels unfit to fight a real war. But what awaited them on the other side of the Atlantic was not what they'd been taught to expect. Beginning in 1943, the United States established over 500 prisoner of war camps across its own territory. From the deserts of Arizona to the forests of Wisconsin and the farmlands of Texas, these camps held nearly 425,000 German POWs by the war's end, more than in any other Allied nation outside Britain. They were guarded, yes, but not brutalized. Most camps followed the Geneva Convention of 1929 to the letter, a decision rooted in both law and strategy. Washington believed that by treating German prisoners humanely, American soldiers captured overseas would be treated the same way. The result was something few Germans could have imagined. Orderly camps with wooden barracks, organized work details, libraries, and even orchestras. In many locations, prisoners were allowed to work on nearby farms or factories, earning small wages redeemable for cigarettes, soap, and snacks from the camp canteen. For men who had lived through the ruins of North Africa or the frozen hell of the Eastern Front, this life, though confined, felt almost surreal. It wasn't paradise. There were strict rules, curfews, and censorship. Escapes were rare, and those who defied the camp structure faced isolation or reassignment to higher security facilities. But compared to the stories they'd been told, of torture, starvation, and racial chaos, life in American captivity seemed almost like another planet. The culture shock began with the smallest details. Uniformed guards who offered cigarettes, English-speaking sergeants who said please and thank you. Meals served on time, hot, plentiful, and far better than the field rations they'd known in the Wehrmacht. Even the bread was soft and white, a luxury few Germans had seen since before the war. For many POWs, their first day in camp was their first true glimpse of the industrial scale of American life. Cafeterias ran like assembly lines. Laundry facilities cleaned thousands of uniforms daily. Trucks arrived filled with supplies that seemed endless. Fresh fruit, canned goods, sugar, coffee, milk. To men from a nation strangled by Allied blockades and bombing raids, it was almost impossible to believe. Some thought it was theater, a display put on to demoralize them, but it wasn't theater. It was simply America functioning at full capacity, even in wartime. Even while shipping millions of tons of supplies across 2 oceans, the country still had enough to feed, clothe, and even indulge its captives. That indulgence is what struck them hardest. The idea that prisoners, enemies, could be given treats. Coca-Cola, chocolate bars, and the occasional scoop of ice cream. To the Germans, these were not just luxuries. They were symbols of something they couldn't define yet, a kind of effortless abundance that defied everything they'd been taught about the decadent, dying West. The U.S. Army didn't plan this as propaganda. It was simply part of the system. American mess halls served what was available. If Coca-Cola was stocked for troops, sometimes the same crates ended up in POW camps. The ice cream came from dairy shipments meant to keep morale high in stateside bases, and a scoop or two often found its way across the wire. It was enough to shake the very foundations of belief. One prisoner later recalled in an interview, "We thought the Americans were poor workers, lazy and disorganized. But their machines worked. Their food was endless. We realized then when we had been lied to." Those early days of captivity began to unravel years of indoctrination, not through speeches or lectures, but through simple, ordinary acts. Clean sheets, a fair guard, a cold drink on a hot day. The war had told them that America was weak. The camps showed them that true strength could look very different, and it was only the beginning. Because as the weeks passed, the Germans in those camps would not just see American abundance, they would begin to taste it, literally. As weeks turned into months, the rhythm of life inside the American prisoner of war camps began to settle. For the captured Germans, the days followed a strange kind of peace. They woke to the sound of bugles, lined up for roll call, and went to work, tending crops, repairing roads, or assisting in local industries that were short on manpower. By noon, they returned for lunch in the mess hall where the trays were full, the coffee was hot, and the atmosphere, while guarded, was surprisingly civil. The work was hard, but the conditions were humane. Prisoners were paid in canteen coupons rather than money, tokens they could spend on small luxuries, cigarettes, candy, postcards, or Coca-Cola. That single product, Coca-Cola, fascinated them more than any other. It was cold, sweet, and carbonated, something no one in Europe had tasted before the war. To many Germans, it symbolized America itself, industrial, consistent, and oddly cheerful. Some POWs began saving their coupons just to buy bottles from the camp canteen. Others traded cigarettes or chocolate for them. One prisoner later wrote in his diary, "We could hear the fizz when we opened it, like music. We drank it slowly, afraid to finish too soon." Even small treats like that carried enormous meaning. They represented normalcy, freedom, and a sense of humanity that had long disappeared from the front. In a world where men had been taught to hate, a bottle of Coca-Cola felt like the first sign that hate didn't have to last forever. Then came the ice cream. It wasn't planned. Ice cream simply appeared one day, as part of a shipment sent to boost morale at nearby American bases. When the camp kitchen received extra, the cooks decided to share it with the prisoners. It melted fast in the summer heat, but for men who hadn't seen real dairy in years, the taste was unforgettable. It wasn't just food, it was shock. Many had grown up in the austerity of 1930s Germany, where luxury was rationed and indulgence frowned upon. To them, the idea of eating something purely for enjoyment was alien. One former POW later recalled, "We thought it was a joke. Ice cream for prisoners? It was impossible. Then we tasted it, and it was the first time in years I remembered home." Moments like that began to soften the edges of war. The Americans didn't try to lecture them about democracy or ideology. They simply let the prisoners see and taste what that system produced. A nation so confident in its strength that it could be generous even to its enemies. Local civilians began to notice the same transformation. Farmers who supervised German work crews often described them as disciplined, polite, and surprisingly respectful. Some were invited to share meals on the porch or help with the harvest. By 1945, thousands of former Wehrmacht soldiers were quietly building friendships with the very people they had been taught to destroy. There was still hierarchy, still caution, still the ever-present wire fences, but inside those fences, an invisible wall was breaking down. Propaganda had told the Germans that America was decadent and divided, a place where greed ruled and culture had died. What they saw was something else entirely: order, abundance, and a strange kind of kindness. Letters home reflected this shift. Although all mail was censored, some lines slipped through. Simple words like, "We are treated well," or "You cannot imagine how much food they have." For families still living under bombing raids and rationing, these words seemed unbelievable. But for the men who wrote them, it was the truth. Even as the war dragged on in Europe, life in the camps became a quiet education. The prisoners saw black and white soldiers working side by side. They listened to jazz and swing over loudspeakers. They watched movies, often newsreels showing Allied victories. But what struck them wasn't the defeat itself. It was the sheer scale of American power. Factories, farms, highways, cities, all still functioning, all still thriving. To many of these men, that realization was more devastating than any battlefield loss. because it meant that the war from the very beginning had been unwinnable. And yet in that defeat there was something quietly redemptive. They were alive. They were treated like men. And for the first time in years they were beginning to feel human again. The story of German POWs in America was more than a tale of captured soldiers adapting to captivity. It was a collision of worlds, a confrontation not on the battlefield but in perception. Every day inside those U.S. camps revealed something that propaganda had worked for years to conceal. That the enemy's power was not just in weapons, but in its way of life. When the first groups of captured Germans arrived in Texas, Georgia, or Nebraska, they looked every bit the image of Hitler's new order. Disciplined, rigid and wary, they still carried the posture of men trained to obey without question, but beneath the surface the war had already stripped them bare. Many had seen comrades burned alive in tanks, starved in retreat or buried in collapsing cities. The camp offered something they hadn't known for years: safety. Not comfort, not freedom, but simple physical safety. That safety began to change them. They slept without fear of air raids. They worked in fields under open skies, not under command of fanatic officers. And at night they heard American guards laughing, singing, sometimes sharing stories through the wire. Slowly the distance between captor and captive began to shrink. For the first time these men were being treated as individuals, not as extensions of a regime. The humanity they received, small, consistent, unforced, began to dissolve the hardness drilled into them. One former POW later said in an interview, "We were defeated by kindness more than by weapons." For Germans raised in a tightly controlled society where even luxury was rationed, the American camp was overwhelming. They saw warehouses stocked with food that could feed an entire division. They saw guards casually discard leftovers they themselves would have treasured. And then there were the small things: Coca-Cola, chewing gum, cigarettes, canned fruit. It wasn't about greed or envy. It was disbelief. How could a country at war produce so much so effortlessly? How could it fight across 2 oceans and still have ice cream in its camps? In German eyes, abundance had always been a sign of weakness, of moral decay. But here abundance was discipline. It was organization. It was the quiet, invisible rhythm of a machine that never stopped working. To the prisoners, it was as if America's wealth came not from exploitation, but from motion and from the idea that everyone, even the lowest worker, contributed to the system's strength. They saw black soldiers driving trucks, women operating machinery, old men supervising farms, and the machine kept moving. That image stayed with them for decades after the war. Inside every camp was a different kind of front: the battle for truth. Many prisoners arrived still loyal to Hitler, convinced the war was turning in Germany's favor. They dismissed American prosperity as illusion, but as the months passed, those illusions cracked. They saw the newspapers, the radio broadcasts, and the endless flow of supplies. They realized the Americans didn't need to lie. For many, the first sip of Coca-Cola was the symbolic moment when that understanding began. It wasn't the drink itself, it was what it represented. In a totalitarian world, nothing was spontaneous, nothing unnecessary. But here was a product made for no reason other than enjoyment. Bottled happiness that traveled farther than most soldiers ever would. The same went for ice cream. It was fragile, perishable, and pointless in war. Yet America made it by the ton and shared it even with its enemies. That was the true propaganda: effortless generosity. Psychologists later studied the phenomenon, calling it reverse indoctrination. The prisoners didn't convert to democracy through lectures. They did it by living within a society that had nothing to prove. What appeared to be simple kindness was, in truth, part of a calculated moral design. The U.S. War Department understood the psychological power of humane treatment. Every letter a POW sent home describing fair rations or respectful guards chipped away at Nazi credibility. It was soft power in its purest form, not through coercion but through contrast. When the war ended and those men returned home, they carried with them not hatred, but memory. Memory of clean barracks, full meals, and small freedoms. Those memories would quietly shape post-war Germany, influencing the very men who would later rebuild it. The American government never intended to reform its captives. It simply obeyed the Geneva Convention and maintained its own standards. But by doing so, it accomplished something far greater. It showed that power without cruelty was possible, and that victory could be achieved not only through destruction, but through dignity. The fences still stood. The guards still watched and the war still raged far away. But inside those camps, the world had already begun to shift. Because every bottle of Coca-Cola and every melting scoop of ice cream carried a message no weapon could deliver. That freedom, even in small gestures, was stronger than fear. To the Americans who guarded them, the German POWs were a strange contradiction. They were enemies, trained killers who had fought ferociously in Tunisia, Sicily, and Normandy. Yet here they were, polite, disciplined, and grateful for meals that most civilians at home were also eating. For many young American soldiers assigned to guard duty, this wasn't the war they had imagined. They expected hatred. Instead, they found men not so different from themselves. At first, suspicion ran deep. The War Department issued strict instructions. No fraternization, no friendship, no trust. But war has a way of softening absolutes. As days turned into months, a quiet respect began to grow through the wire. Guards often joked with prisoners, sharing cigarettes or talking about baseball. And in return, the Germans offered carpentry, music, or mechanical skill. In many camps, POWs repaired vehicles, built furniture, or played in orchestras for both prisoners and guards. American officers noticed the discipline and efficiency of these men, traits that mirrored their own military culture. It created an unspoken acknowledgement. Two armies, shaped by different ideologies but bound by the same code of professionalism. Some of the guards began to see the prisoners not as symbols of Nazism, but as victims of it. They could tell which ones were the true believers and which were simply soldiers caught in history's machinery. And the more they saw, the harder it became to hate them. For America, the humane treatment of POWs wasn't weakness. It was proof of strength. This was a country fighting across continents, producing millions of tons of weapons and yet still capable of restraint. To treat enemies fairly in the middle of the bloodiest war in history was, in itself, a victory of principle. It wasn't perfect. There were incidents of violence, accidents, and rare moments of cruelty, inevitable in any system so large. But compared to other theaters of war, the U.S. camps were almost utopian. German officers later said that being captured by the Americans was a miracle of fortune, and that reputation mattered. As word of the treatment spread through letters and Red Cross visits, morale among German soldiers in Europe quietly shifted. Many began surrendering more readily, preferring capture by the Americans over the brutality of the Eastern Front. It became an invisible weapon, mercy, as a tool of strategy. Back in Germany, Nazi propaganda worked hard to suppress these stories. The regime feared that tales of well-fed, well-treated prisoners would weaken morale. Instead, they circulated lies, claiming POWs were enslaved, tortured, or starved. But by 1944, even those lies began to unravel. Letters from captured soldiers slipped through censors, describing soft beds, plentiful food, and the unthinkable luxury of cold drinks. Some families didn't believe it. Others did, and began to wonder what kind of enemy could afford such generosity. That doubt was powerful, because if America could be humane and powerful at the same time, what did that say about the system that had sent their sons to war? Meanwhile, in the United States, public opinion toward the prisoners was mixed. Some towns welcomed them. Others resented seeing the enemy working in local fields while American sons fought overseas. Newspapers occasionally published stories of German POWs enjoying ice cream or soda, sparking outrage among families who had lost loved ones in Europe. To calm tensions, the government reminded the public that fair treatment of prisoners protected American soldiers in German hands. But not everyone saw it as mere policy. Many guards, farmers, and factory supervisors saw it as a moral statement, proof that America could remain decent even when the world was burning. That was a quiet kind of patriotism, one that didn't need victory parades to feel real. By the end of 1945, as Germany surrendered and the camps began to empty, something had changed in both directions. For the Americans, victory was no longer just about flags and front lines. It was about maintaining humanity in a war designed to destroy it. For the Germans, defeat was no longer just military. It was ideological. They had been defeated not only by weapons, but by a way of life that proved everything they'd been taught was wrong. Many of the men who had once sipped Coca-Cola behind barbed wire would return home to a country in ruins. They would tell their families of the America they had seen, the land where prisoners were fed ice cream, where guards shared laughter, where even in war there was decency. Those stories would become seeds, quiet, invisible, but lasting. They would shape the West German generation that rebuilt a democratic nation from the ashes. Historians often say that the Cold War began the moment World War II ended. But for thousands of German POWs, the New World had already begun long before that. In the taste of sugar, in the sound of laughter, and in the realization that the future belonged not to fear, but to freedom. The fences would come down, the camps would close, and the prisoners would sail home. But they would never forget that first taste of Coca-Cola, of ice cream, of something sweeter than victory itself. The discovery that even in war, kindness could be stronger than ideology. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing. But inside the POW camps scattered across the United States, life continued in quiet order. Each sunrise brought the same routines: roll call, work details, meals served on schedule. The air was calm, almost peaceful, but beneath that stillness something deeper was happening. The war inside these men, the war of ideas, and was beginning to end as well. For months they had lived surrounded by a world that defied everything they had been taught. They had expected brutality and chaos, yet found discipline and generosity. They had been told Americans were lazy and crude, yet saw precision in everything from the mess hall to the mail service. And they had been told democracy was weak, but the machine that fed them, clothed them, and fought across two oceans was anything but weak. One morning, as news spread through the camp that Hitler was dead, the silence was overwhelming. The guards didn't celebrate, the prisoners didn't cheer. There was only the sound of wind moving through the flagpoles and a kind of shared understanding that something immense had ended. Some men lowered their heads, others simply stared at the horizon. A few whispered prayers, not for victory but for home. Later that day, the camp's American commander announced over the loudspeaker that Germany had surrendered. He didn't gloat, he didn't even raise his voice. He simply said, "The war in Europe is over." Then he told the guards to serve dessert with dinner, ice cream for everyone. That evening, the Germans lined up quietly in the mess hall. Each man was handed a bowl, the same as the guards received. Some ate slowly, others stared at it before taking a single bite. There was no bitterness, only reflection. For many, that scoop of melting vanilla was the taste of an ending. The first time in years they could eat something without fear, without rationing, without ideology. For weeks afterward, the mood in the camp shifted. There were no longer discussions about the front or Hitler's speeches. Instead, they talked about what they had seen in America: the factories, the food, the freedom, the things that had once seemed impossible. Some said the Americans could never understand what it meant to live under fear. Others replied quietly, maybe they never had to because they built a country where they didn't need to. At night, in the barracks, the prisoners listened to the hum of power lines, the passing trucks, the distant trains that never stopped. Even those sounds became symbols, proof that somewhere beyond the wire the world kept moving. It was a rhythm that no bomb could stop, no army could imitate. It was what had truly won the war. Among the prisoners were teachers, engineers, and students, men who had once believed in the superiority of German efficiency. But in America they saw a kind of efficiency that came from cooperation, not fear. They saw black soldiers treated better than they had expected, and women working in offices and factories with authority. It was confusing, even disorienting. But slowly, they began to understand. One German mechanic who had worked in the camp motor pool wrote after the war, "In Germany, we were taught that machines served the state. In America, the state served the machines, so that everyone could move. That is why they won." Another remembered a guard who had offered him a Coca-Cola during a long workday. He said it wasn't the drink that changed him. It was the gesture. He didn't see an enemy. He saw a man who was tired, and for the first time I realized that was all I ever was. These moments, small, almost invisible, became turning points. Each one chipped away at the armor of ideology. Each one replaced suspicion with curiosity, and curiosity with respect. By the summer of 1945, the camps began preparing for repatriation. Some prisoners were relieved. Others were quietly afraid. They had changed too much. The thought of returning to a ruined, divided homeland filled them with unease. They wondered what they would say to those still loyal to the Reich. Would anyone believe them if they told the truth, that the enemy had treated them better than their own leaders ever had? One group of prisoners was asked by a Red Cross officer what they had learned during captivity. Their spokesman paused for a long time, then said, "We learned that freedom is not noise or chaos. It's quiet. It's the sound of people who have enough." The officer wrote those words down. Decades later, they would appear in post-war studies on the psychological rehabilitation of German POWs. It wasn't re-education through lectures or politics. It was re-education through decency. When the trains finally arrived to take them home, many prisoners looked back at the camp one last time. The guards saluted them. Some prisoners saluted back. No one said a word. The war was over. Not just the one fought with rifles, but the one fought in their minds. They had come to America as soldiers of a totalitarian empire. They left as witnesses to something stronger, a society that had conquered them without hatred. And all it had taken was a meal served with dignity, a cold drink shared without suspicion, and a taste of something that had no place in war: sweetness. The journey home began in silence. Across hundreds of American camps, trains filled with German prisoners rolled toward the Atlantic ports. The guards shook hands with them, some offering cigarettes or candy for the road. There was no anger, no triumph, only a sense of finality. The men were going home to a country that no longer existed. The voyage across the ocean was long and uneasy. They had left behind barracks that were safe, orderly, even comforting. Now they faced the unknown, a homeland reduced to rubble and hunger. For weeks they watched the endless gray water, each man alone with his thoughts. Some whispered that America had won because it had more machines. Others said America had won because it had more humanity. No one argued. When the ships reached Europe, the silence deepened. At Le Havre, at Cherbourg, at Liverpool, they disembarked in small groups and were handed over to Allied authorities. For some, the journey ended in British or French labor camps where conditions were harsher and the food scarce. Only later would they be allowed to return to Germany. By late 1946, when the first waves of POWs finally stepped back onto German soil, they found a world they scarcely recognized. The cities were broken skeletons of stone and ash. The train stations were hollowed out. Everywhere the air smelled of coal smoke and dust. For men who had lived in the quiet order of American camps, this was a shock deeper than defeat. They had left a world that still moved, and returned to one that had stopped. Families greeted them with tears, but also confusion. Some didn't know how to speak to men who had lived among their former enemies. Others were quietly resentful, believing the POWs had survived too easily while their own loved ones had perished in bombings or on the Eastern Front. The returnees tried to explain what they had seen, what they had learned. But the words rarely fit. How could they describe Coca-Cola to people who hadn't seen sugar in years? How could they talk about abundance to those living in ruins? In those first months, many of the former POWs felt like strangers in their own country. The Germany they had left had been full of certainty, rigid, disciplined, proud. The one they came back to was humbled and broken, and yet in that brokenness they saw something familiar, the same vulnerability they had once felt as prisoners. They began to understand that survival, not victory, was the real triumph. Some of them became translators for Allied authorities, helping rebuild local administrations. Others worked as engineers, teachers, or farmers. Wherever they went, they carried memories of another kind of order, one based on efficiency without cruelty, authority without fear. Many said they wanted to bring that spirit into their work, quietly shaping the foundation of the new Germany. A few even opened small shops or businesses inspired by what they had seen in America. One former POW began bottling his own soda in Munich, saying, "If they could make happiness in a bottle, maybe we can too." Another opened an ice cream stand using powdered milk from U.S. aid shipments. Children who had grown up among ruins tasted it and smiled, just as he once had behind barbed wire. For him, that was redemption. Historians later called it the quiet transformation, the moral reorientation of a generation that had lost everything except perspective. The men who had been captured as soldiers returned as witnesses to another civilization's strength, not its weapons, but its values. They had seen a country that had the power to destroy them and chose not to. And in that choice, they had glimpsed the real meaning of freedom. For many years, few spoke openly about their time in captivity. It wasn't pride that kept them silent, and it was gratitude. They felt they had been shown mercy they didn't deserve, and that memory was both comforting and humbling. Some wrote memoirs decades later, often including the same recurring image: a guard sharing a soda, a cook handing them ice cream, the sound of laughter on a summer day. They described it as the moment the world shifted, when they realized that the enemy they had been taught to fear had never been the monster they imagined. One former prisoner wrote in his journal, "They won because they could afford kindness." It was a sentence simple enough to be overlooked, but powerful enough to define an era. He wasn't speaking of wealth or luxury. He meant that America's strength lay in its ability to remain human in the middle of destruction. By the 1950s, as West Germany began to rebuild, many of these former POWs became part of the quiet backbone of the new republic. Men who believed that power without morality was nothing, and that the true lesson of war was not conquest but restraint. They taught their children that the measure of a nation was not how it fought, but how it treated those it defeated. Some of them even returned to America years later, not as prisoners but as visitors, standing freely on the same soil where they had once been guarded. They found that the country had changed, grown, moved on, but when they drank a bottle of Coca-Cola again, they felt the same taste: cold, sweet, and strange. And for a moment they were young men again, tasting freedom for the first time. The end of the war left the world in ruins, but for those who had once worn the gray uniforms of the Wehrmacht, survival came with a strange responsibility. They had seen both sides of civilization, the brutality of total war and the quiet decency of their former captors. And as they stepped into the ruins of their homeland, that contrast became the compass by which they rebuilt their lives. Germany in 1946 was a country stripped of illusion. Its cities were piles of stone. Its people lived on rations measured in grams. Coal was scarce, power unreliable, and hunger constant. But within that emptiness, something new was forming. A recognition that the values that had once guided them had failed completely. The old certainties of nationalism and racial superiority were gone. What replaced them was the memory of a different kind of order, one they had seen from behind fences across the ocean. The men who had returned from American captivity began to talk, not loudly, not publicly, but in workshops, classrooms, and family tables. They spoke about fairness, about structure without fear, about how discipline could exist without cruelty. They described the strange decency of guards who had treated them as equals, and the efficiency of a system that functioned because people trusted it. These conversations, quiet and scattered, helped shape the moral foundation of a generation that would one day lead West Germany. The American government understood this more clearly than anyone. Even before the Marshall Plan, there was an awareness that Germany's recovery could not be built on punishment alone. It had to be built on understanding, and the POW experience had become an unexpected bridge. Reports from the U.S. War Department described former prisoners as potential partners in reconstruction, men who had seen American democracy up close and no longer saw it as weak. They were living proof that ideas could survive even in captivity. When the Marshall Plan began in 1948, many of these men became interpreters, engineers, and local administrators, helping coordinate aid shipments, rebuild infrastructure, and reorganize municipal systems. They were not driven by ideology anymore, but by gratitude. Gratitude for having survived, and for having been treated like men when they no longer felt like soldiers. Historians later noted how many post-war mayors, teachers, and civil servants had been POWs in America. They brought back not just technical skills, but a new sense of civic order. They had seen democracy function under stress, and they knew it could work. They knew that leadership didn't have to come from fear, that unity could come from cooperation rather than command. Their memories also helped soften German attitudes toward the United States during the early years of occupation. Unlike the bitter resentment that often followed wars, many Germans regarded the Americans with a quiet respect. They remembered the taste of food they hadn't expected to receive, the simple decency of being treated as human beings, and the moments of dignity that no propaganda could erase. This goodwill became one of the cornerstones of the Western alliance that would emerge in the 1950s. When the Cold War began, and the United States sought to rebuild Europe as a bulwark against Soviet expansion, West Germany's cooperation came not only from necessity, but from memory. The men who once stood behind barbed wire drinking Coca-Cola were now sitting at desks helping draft policies for a democratic nation. They didn't need convincing that America's system worked. They had lived it firsthand. In this way, the POW camps had achieved something remarkable. What began as a logistical necessity, the housing of hundreds of thousands of captured soldiers, had become one of the most successful unintentional experiments in post-war diplomacy. It proved that even in victory, humanity could be a weapon, one that lasted longer than any bullet or bomb. The men who had once been Germany's enemies were now its silent teachers. And though history would rarely remember their names, the lessons they carried of mercy, fairness, and the taste of a different kind of freedom would quietly help rebuild a nation from the ashes of its own destruction. In the years that followed, the story of the German POWs faded from the headlines, but its legacy lingered in the minds of those who had lived it. While Europe rebuilt its cities, these men rebuilt something harder to measure: trust. They had returned to a homeland divided and uncertain, yet they carried with them the memory of a society that had remained whole even in war. And that memory became a quiet blueprint for Germany's future. During the late 1940s and early 1950s, the mood across West Germany began to shift from despair to determination. New towns rose from ruins, factories restarted, and families began to believe in tomorrow again. But behind this visible recovery lay an invisible transformation, one shaped in part by the thousands who had seen America up close. They had experienced what it meant for a government to function not through fear, but through participation. They had witnessed fairness enforced not by threat, but by principle. Many of them became part of the reconstruction effort. In schools, they spoke to children about the importance of honesty and hard work. In offices, they introduced democratic habits: open discussion, shared responsibility, respect for process. Some even used the lessons they had learned behind barbed wire as moral examples, recalling how a system that treated its enemies with dignity had emerged stronger than one built on terror. This quiet moral awakening blended with America's physical presence in post-war Europe. The GIs who now patrolled German streets were not conquerors. They were symbols of a new order. They brought with them not just weapons and uniforms, but culture: jazz, chewing gum, films, and that same Coca-Cola that had once startled prisoners. To a generation that had grown up under slogans and scarcity, this was both strange and seductive. America represented not just victory, but vitality, the proof that prosperity and freedom could coexist. Sociologists in the 1950s called it the soft re-education. Unlike the forced ideological campaigns that followed other wars, the American approach relied on example rather than enforcement. The POWs had been the first test case, living evidence that exposure to democratic life could reshape beliefs without coercion. Now the same philosophy guided West Germany's rebirth. Schools emphasized civic duty instead of obedience. Public offices valued service instead of hierarchy. And gradually, the idea of authority itself began to change. For the former prisoners, this transformation felt deeply personal. When they saw American cars on German streets or neon Coca-Cola signs above new cafes, they felt a strange mix of nostalgia and understanding. These weren't just symbols of a foreign power. They were reminders of the humanity that had saved them. The taste of a drink, the rhythm of jazz on a radio, the freedom to speak. One's mind, all of it carried echoes of the world they had once glimpsed through the wire. Some historians argue that the seeds of West Germany's democratic miracle, the Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle, were planted not only by American money but by American mercy. The POW's stories proved that decency was not a weakness, that generosity could be strategic, and that the strength of a nation lay not in control, but in confidence. By the mid-1950s, when former prisoners began reuniting for small gatherings, their conversations often drifted back to those early days in the camps. They spoke not of humiliation, but of awakening. They remembered the guards who shared cigarettes, the meals that came without fear, the moments when the world's most powerful country had treated them as equals. Many said that was when they first understood what real victory looked like, not the domination of an enemy, but the triumph of restraint. In time, these men grew old and their memories softened, but one detail never faded: that first taste. Coca-Cola and ice cream. Simple, ordinary things that had somehow carried the weight of an entire civilization's values. They had arrived as symbols of defeat, but had become reminders of how quickly hate can dissolve when met with unexpected kindness. When historians today look back on the story of German POWs in America, they see more than a wartime curiosity. They see one of the quietest revolutions of the 20th century, a revolution not won by force but by example. It proved that power, when tempered by humanity, can change more than borders. It can change hearts. In the story of war, victory is often written in smoke and steel, but sometimes its truest form appears in silence, in the small, human moments that follow destruction. For the German prisoners who once stood behind American fences, the war ended not with a gunshot or a flag, but with a taste, a bottle of Coca-Cola, a scoop of melting ice cream. Symbols so simple they seemed absurd in a world built on hate. Yet in those flavors they found something their leaders had promised but never delivered: a glimpse of dignity, of joy without consequence, of freedom that didn't need to shout. The United States had defeated its enemies not only through production or strategy, but through character. It proved that power could exist without cruelty, that mercy could be stronger than vengeance, and that humanity itself could be a weapon, one that conquered not cities, but hearts. Years later, when those men spoke to their children about the war, they rarely mentioned battles. They talked instead about kindness, about fairness, about the strange country that treated its enemies as guests. And in those stories lay the quiet victory of democracy, a victory not of ideology, but of example, because long after the guns went silent, the lesson remained that the true measure of civilization isn't how fiercely it fights, but how gently it triumphs. That in the coldest moments of history, compassion can still warm the human soul, and that sometimes the most powerful thing a nation can give its enemies is a taste of what peace feels like.